Hi everyone, and welcome to this re-recorded talk from the Social Psychology Days conference that was on April 15th, 2021 on behalf of the Swearing and Good Health Working Group. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about the parallels between humour and swearing for well-being. So my name is Dr. Thomas Rees-Evans. I am an Associate Professor in Occupational Psychology at the University of Greenwich. I have a PhD in emotional intelligence and affect-related individual differences. But I joined the original consortium for research about profanity to bring a perspective around emotion regulation and to really emphasize the value of different psychological approaches that might have value. So if anybody wants to get in touch, feel free to contact me via Twitter at Thomas37, and my email address is there too. So I thought we could first start off by exploring some shared assumptions between humour and swearing and well-being. So the first assumption is that all swearing negatively impacts well-being. I think it's very easy to accept the socially constructed view of swearing as morally and socially damaging or problematic, when in fact it is likely that swearing has lots of different impacts in different circumstances, depending upon a wide variety of factors. So we should be perhaps cautious in accepting that view. And we should be cautious of exactly the same when we're talking about humour. So humour is often considered ideologically positive. It's always considered to be a good thing. If somebody was called humorous or made people laugh, you would say that would be a good thing. But what research by Rod Martin et al. have conducted has suggested there are lots of different types of humour. Here are four that they place on the basis of two continuums, that it could be focused on other people, or it could be focused about yourself, and it could be positive or it could be negative. And in doing so, there are four types of humour. Now, affiliative is the most kind of commonly perceived stereotypical type of humour. That's the kind of socially positive, the glue that holds relationships together. However, there are lots of other different kinds, and we can imagine that these different types of humour have different outcomes with respect to well-being. I imagine aggressive humour probably not particularly strong for facilitating your own and others' well-being, although even that in of itself shouldn't be a hard and fast rule. So not all humour types are likely to be positive for well-being. It can depend on a variety of other factors. Now, our second assumption is that swearing is inherently negative, and that in of itself, that negativity is the function by which it drives well-being. So by the fact that it is a socially, morally, or otherwise problematic behaviour, that in of itself is enough to suggest that this is a problematic practice. So it kind of creates this black box model of, well, there is some process by which swearing impacts well-being. It must just be because it's negative. And I think the exact same thing can be said for humour. Humour isn't just positive or negative. There are different types, as we've explored. But it's often perceived to be ideologically positive, when in fact we know that humour can achieve lots of different things, whether that be it can change workplace dynamics, it can overturn societal expectations, or indeed can be used to communicate hate. It's got the potential to do lots of different things, in which case, is it just sufficient to say that humour works because it's positive, or swearing works because it's negative? I think what it's likely to suggest is there are lots of different ways in which these sorts of behaviours, these sorts of different emotion regulation strategies, can impact outcomes. Now, the other third assumption is that we can quite clearly appreciate and understand the kind of processes by which swearing or indeed humour link to well-being. And you often see these sorts of stage-like models to suggest I enact this sort of behaviour, it does something either for myself or for the people around me, and that impacts well-being. And I'm not sure that these sorts of models are that suitably equipped to deal with the complexity of emotion regulation strategies such as humour or such as swearing, which have lots of different functions, lots of different impacts, depending on quite a wide range of factors. And indeed, when we look at the literature behind humour, we find the exact same thing. You could suggest there are pathways through inter and intrapersonal factors, but in fact, there are so many different social functions of humour. You can see here self-disclosure, norm violation, maintaining or changing hierarchy, creating an identity or cohesion. Couldn't the exact same things be said about swearing? Swearing can in fact do a lot of these things. And some of my own discursive research has looked at how comedians can use swearing and aggressive terms to create identities, and in fact that in of itself creates humour. So what we have is a number of shared assumptions that either it's good or bad, so humour is ideologically positive or swearing is inevitably negative or problematic. The second, that negativity or positivity is in fact the driver, and in fact that there are processes to drive well-being that we are well informed of and well appreciate within models. These things don't all stack up, unfortunately. So my thinking was that perhaps if there is a gap in our understanding around all these sorts of misconceptions around swearing or around humour use, could we perhaps then look at each field and see whether there are kind of some shared understandings? And indeed, when we do have a look at that, what we can find is that both swearing and humour are considered emotion regulation strategies. The definition of which is a kind of cognitive or behavioural strategy that you can use to change your emotional trajectory. So we have this process model of emotion regulation by Gross, and you can see here there are various different key stages. So we have the first, which is we choose what situation we put ourselves in. So an emotion regulation strategy here would be avoidance, right? We can try and avoid situations until inevitably they come forth. The second is situation modification, and this is within the event itself. A good example of this would be social support searching, a well-researched emotion regulation strategy where you try to bring in others to help or support you. Then you have your assessment of the event, and this can be done during the event itself, and you have your attentional deployment, so things like whether you choose to ruminate or to try and distract yourself from certain aspects of that experience, and also cognitive reappraisal. So do you see this situation as a threat, perhaps, something that has to be overcome, or perhaps a challenge, something that could prove to be positive in the longer term? And then we finally have the response stage. Now, this is often where a lot of the research tends to kind of focus upon, particularly if we look at things like substance use, whether that be kind of nicotine, alcohol, or other such substances. So when we look or consider where humour and swearing could be in these different stages, we can definitely see it in the response stage, so afterwards we can do so. But it can also be seen as part of an assessment of an event as well. And when you try and look at models of humour and swearing, that's where they put them in towards the end of this trajectory rather than the start. But obviously we should, there's differentiation between when, with who it's enacted. That's infrequently discussed and infrequently kind of placed as important, but could in fact help differentiate between them. So this model helps kind of unite swearing and humour, shows there are similarities, and there are some others as well. So if we continue our exploration of this model, there is proposed to be 4 key stages. So we first have an emotion, so that's experienced by either ourselves or others. And the second is we identify A, the emotion, and then B, the need to respond, the need to kind of do some sort of goal-orientated behaviour. Then is the selection strategy. So we have a wide range of emotion regulation strategies available to us. How we cope is often very, very unique, in which case we have to choose which strategy do we enact and then enact that. So implementation, the final stage. And then hopefully, if you implement your strategy successfully, you've resolved any negative emotions or you've increased any positive emotions, and you can see the sort of cyclical kind of evaluation process that happens. Now, there are similarities between humour and swearing in this sort of process. So typically, measurement of humour and swearing are in two ways. The first is through questionnaires, so tell me about the last week or the last month, or generally how often do you tend to enact such behaviour. Or there are experimental studies where we say, I'm going to manipulate this or change you or ask you to do this or not to do this, and look at the impacts. And we can see here that these can be quite clearly mapped onto this emotion regulation process. So typical use via questionnaires is probably the selection aspect of it. So it's whether you choose to use humour or whether you choose to swear in any given context. Then we have the more contextualized use, so not just broadly how often do we use it, but where do we use it? And that's probably where we capture the kind of implementation stage through experimental work, where we have a look at what happens when we do or don't use this type of strategy. So I think this sort of process model is really helpful to show why there are so many similarities between humour and swearing. But as someone who has some research background around humour, more so than swearing, I thought there was a little bit more that I could bring to my swearing group by looking at humour theories themselves. So I'm going to briefly run through just a few of the different types of psychological theories that have been applied to humour, and we can see how they might have also some useful functions in explaining swearing. So the first is disparagement or superiority theories, and the suggestion that humour is a form of aggression. Plato suggested laughter originates in malice, and it was suggested that we use this as a way of ever increasing or demonstrating our aggression or power within a situation. And indeed, laughter was termed the roar of triumph when you succeeded. And I think there are certainly some elements of this which may be true for swearing as well. Swearing certainly can and is seen as a form of aggression. And we also see, in the same way we see humorous exchanges where one person makes a joke, they all laugh, another person makes a joke, they make everybody laugh. This sort of kind of duel of wits and this kind of cyclical exchange can definitely also be seen in swearing use, where when one individual swears, it encourages others to use similar types of words. Now, another interesting nuance around this sort of theory is the complete opposite. So, Cavalier humour beliefs are the suggestion that a joke is just a joke. There's nothing in it. There's absolutely nothing meant by it. We all know, of course, humour is often based on, if not the truth, a kernel of truth, and that's quite often where the humour or the humorousness of the joke originates. We can consider the same when we think about swearing, when people say, oh, it's not actually a swear word, or if I put an asterisk instead of a letter, so it obscures it slightly, then I'm not really swearing. So these sort of mock swear words. And I think there may be some parallels in what can be understood from both swearing and humour, perhaps considering these sorts of exchanges from a kind of aggression or superiority framework. The second is termed arousal theory, and it was suggested there is a inverted U-shape between arousal and pleasure. That is, there is an optimum level of arousal, obviously not sexual arousal. I'm talking here about general kind of awakeness and interest and engagement. And it was suggested that humour has two functions. So humour can either deaden a very intense situation, which often can be a very strong thing, Or when things are a bit dull and boring, a bit of humour can, in fact, increase awareness and engagement. And so it has this boost or lag function, trying to optimize arousal. And obviously, pleasure associated with the arousal boost or lag is laughter. So it's a sign of your reaching or going closer towards kind of optimum arousal. Now, when we look at the literature, it actually suggests the relationship is perhaps more linear than that. However, there are ways in which we could apply this arousal theory to swearing, because we could see a similar function for swearing, both to increase arousal by increasing people's engagement and interest in the situation, or in fact to decrease it by de-escalating situations. And obviously there's some very interesting discussions to be had around whether swearing is an escalator or a de-escalator of things like violent exchanges. But perhaps not something that we can consider today. The final theory I want to talk about is Incongruity Theory. This is a more cognitive kind of perspective. It's based upon Schopenhauer's suggestion that laughter is just an expression of incongruity, right? You suggest that you see that something isn't right, but it's funny, it's amusing, because you understand that rule. A good example of this is the joke, why do people become bakers? Because they need the dough. So obviously you can read this as they need money, or because they physically need the dough. And we could expect perhaps the same sort of framework here in terms of incongruity for swearing, where it is expected, where it's predicted, where it's seen as suitable, and we can draw some sense from it, then perhaps it is more acceptable. And where perhaps it's unexpected, but we don't understand why it's there, so there's no sense behind it, that might be problematic. There is perhaps some parallels here to consider, mostly around contextual factors, something which these sorts of process-based models that we've looked at earlier in terms of, it's an interpersonal or intrapersonal process, tends to forget about, perhaps. So there are a variety of different kind of psychological theories about humour that can in fact be applied to swearing. So there's some value here in looking at both theories. Now, of course, there are some other factors to consider as well. So just to very briefly note some, we have to attempt to unite findings from different measurement approaches. So we know, for example, that questionnaire use tends to capture selection and experimental work tends to capture implementation. But these findings don't always coalesce. They don't always tell the same story. And so we must be working on some way of uniting these different behaviours and different stages of the process together towards a more coherent evidence base. We also have issues with jingle-jangle fallacies. So when we give something the same label when it's different, or give something a different label when we're talking about the same thing. And I think there is often this sort of issue with humour and swearing. So what one person calls a swear word, or what one person calls a certain type of joke or a certain type of humorous exchange, might be different to others. And so there is this definite jingle-jangle in terms of making sure that when we're talking about humour, or we're talking about swearing, or indeed certain types of, that we're talking about the same thing, that there is this shared language amongst academics, practitioners, and hopefully the general public too. We also have a lot of research to do to explore better the role of social and emotional norms for both humour and swearing, because obviously these are really important kind of social practices. And this is something which is extremely hard to research effectively, and so we see very little robust evidence to explore this. We also have to overcome a lot of misconceptions around humour and swearing, like the fact that humour is ideologically positive, or that swearing is completely negative, when clearly it's not just that there are, it's not black and white. There are not only various shades of grey, there are also various different processes by which this might happen. We also have to find out how best to learn from these interrelated fields. Research tends to be quite siloed in placing certain fields within one stream of research but not others. Whereas clearly, despite humour and swearing not being researched particularly commonly together, there are lots of parallels in theories, approaches and measurement styles which could be really useful to learn from each other. And we also know that trying to group individuals into, for example, different types of humour user are quite problematic. So I've done some recent cross-cultural research looking at whether there are kind of universal ways in which people use humour, and you can be categorised quite easily into a certain type of humour user. This and a lot of other group-based research often simplifies a more complex understanding which is capable of being more effective and being more useful for understanding. So there are lots of kind of gaps in not only our approaches to things, but also our kind of analytical approaches and our ways of thinking or simplifying things, which might be intuitively quite accessible and easy and desirable, but actually somewhat problematic. And finally, we broadly, as a community of scientists, researchers, practitioners, and general public, need to better understand A, how to produce good quality evidence, B, how to disseminate that, and then C, how to identify that, to work out what is good, what is bad, or what is preferable, and how best to implement that. And I think there's often a long way to go with both fields. So there are lots of ongoing questions for us in both fields. My view, perhaps by coming together, we might be able to share some understanding and share some of these journey developments. So in sum, it's complicated. There are lots of parallels between humour and swearing, so lots of potential for us to join forces and to understand fields better together. Lots of potential to learn. However, there too are lots of unknowns, lots of things we don't know enough about yet. So as always, be cautious and think about using evidence only when the evidence is of sufficient quality to convince you that it will actually be useful. At the moment, there's just too many unknowns. Thanks so much for joining me. I really hope you've enjoyed this brief talk. And as always, feel free to get in touch with any questions, thoughts, or in fact, good swear words in different languages or funny jokes. I like to hear all of them. And I appreciate you getting in touch. Thanks so much. Take care.